Welcome to the Switchbox Speaker Series. I'm your host, Jack Maddens. This is the final talk of our mini season of talks, and we've heard a lot about the hopes and early plans for things like utility thermal energy networks in New York, legislation that is enabling zonal electrification in California, modeling the future of gas with integrated resource planning in Minnesota, and advanced digital twin simulation to plan for citywide electrification in Ithaca, all of which you can watch if you missed them. So it feels fitting that after all that dreaming and hoping and planning, it feels fitting that we'll hear from someone today who's been on the receiving end of all that policy and planning. In 2024, state legislators proposed 42 bills across 14 states to promote the development of geothermal heat pumps. But what's happening on the ground? Kathy Hannun is the founder and CEO of Dandelion Energy, and they have seen it all. They are building out a national installer network for their ground source heat pumps and have done over 3,000 installs in over 5 states. So we invited her to the speaker series to share her thoughts on the good, the bad, and the unintended consequences of your state's approach to geothermal. I'm really excited to have Kathy here. Welcome and take it away.
Thanks for having me. And I see John Chiavaco in the audience, so a special hello to him. He's also an expert in this topic and our first geothermal installation partner we ever had as a company back when we first started. So it's great to see you here. So I'm just going to give a quick presentation. The theme is the good, the bad, and the ugly. And for each of these categories, I'm just going to talk about two policies. So two examples that have been really good for geothermal. By bad, the way I'm interpreting bad in this presentation is good intention, but not that useful. And then the ugly are just things that make it hard to install geothermal heat pumps. So then we'll end with a few themes in my interpretation of what distinguishes the good, the bad, and the ugly. So this one might be kind of obvious, but one thing that's been really good for the industry is the Inflation Reduction Act and the federal tax credits. So right now, and we'll see if this continues to be the case, but right now there is a 30% federal tax credit for 10 years for homeowners that adopt geothermal who have the tax appetite, which most do. And there are additional incentives for other energy efficiency projects, as I'm sure most of you are aware. And the 30% incentive actually can be 40% or even 50%, depending for builders or sort of commercial project owners putting in geothermal. And so it just adds up. It's like a huge help. You can see on the right, I've put an example, just what these tax credits do to the net cost for the homeowner. It can, combined with other incentives in the market, can cut it almost in half. And one thing that I really like about the tax credit, besides the fact that 30% is a lot, is it's the same across the entire country. So it's like very uniform. It's very straightforward to explain to homeowners what it means to them. It's like 30% off the cost. It's very simple and easy to explain. Okay, next example of a good thing. Flat or per ton utility incentives. So geothermal heat pumps are well incentivized in the Northeast, especially with utilities, though utilities across the country do have geothermal heat pump incentives. Some of the largest ones that we see, so Con Edison incentivizes geothermal heat pumps at $25,000 per home. And this is a flat rate. So if you're a small home that needs a 2-ton heat pump, but you importantly, with geothermal, you switch your whole home over. This is not like a mini split where you add it to an existing system, but people adopting geo are getting rid of their furnace or boiler and switching their whole home to geo. So if you do that and you have a small home that needs a small heat pump or a giant mansion that needs 7 heat pumps, you will get $25,000 from Con Edison. They actually do have a few regions where it's a little bit more. But again, what I really love about this incentive, both it's big, which is obviously helpful to our homeowners, but also it's very easy to understand. It's the same for everyone. It's just very simple. Eversource in Massachusetts has a similar incentive at $15,000 a home. And then some utilities have per ton incentives, so they vary with the size of the geothermal system, but it's still quite easy to interpret and understand and transact. And these incentives have made such a big difference with geothermal heat pump adoption. When I first started in my journey of installing geo, NYSERDA, New York, there weren't really utility incentives that were very common, at least in the Northeast, but New York had a per ton incentive, and then that made it possible to even start the company. I think it would have been hard to do this at all without that type of incentive. So these have been very effective, and wherever we see them crop up in different utilities, a lot more geo volume tends to follow. So those are two examples of the good. Giving an example of the bad, and again, it's not really bad, it's just kind of uh, things that I appreciate what they're trying to do, but they're hard to enact, I guess. So one example of this are subsidized loans that are unpredictably subsidized. And this is a lot of states have subsidized loans for homeowners who would like to adopt energy efficiency or electrification products, including heat pumps. But in our experience, while these can be useful, it can be challenging to really get them to have the impact that I know they're intended to have, because many of them have different interest rates depending on a home, like very personal information about a homeowner's financial situation or income. And this is hard because like you can't tell, like the homeowner's first question when they're considering geothermal is like, how much will this cost? And you can't answer that question until you know a lot of really intimate information about the homeowner. And that just makes it hard to have a straightforward conversation and a cost of like it's hard as the company to like invest the resources required to vet this question enough to give homeowners an answer to a very simple question. Also, sometimes these interest rates vary by zip code, which is also just complicated. It's like you have to look up in a table and then like have different presentations for different homeowners, and it just adds complexity, I guess, to the conversation. Some of these loans also have a low max amount, um, which makes it so that the homeowner will have to take more than one loan to finance a project, which is just a lot more work for everyone and might make it less likely to be used because they might not have a second loan available to them. And then the third issue that we often see is that some of these loans are only paid to the contractor after the installation is fully complete. And for geothermal heat pumps in particular, um, these projects involve doing a lot of design work, getting permits and paying for those permits, having a drill rig come and put in a ground loop in the yard, trenching the ground loop into the house, and then retrofitting the house with a geothermal heat pump. and that happens over a period of time that can be weeks to months. And so if the contractor has to have the cash to like front all of those costs until the very end and only then get paid by the loan provider, it's just not possible for most contractors. And the homeowner obviously doesn't have the funds to cover all of that, which is why they're using the loan. So those are some of the issues that we typically see with these subsidized loan products, though I will say, I hope I don't sound like I'm complaining too much because I really do think subsidized loans are super useful, especially in today's interest rate environment. Just the simple, like loans that consider these issues are going to be more effective at actually driving geothermal heat pump adoption. All right, another example of a well-intended policy that doesn't move the needle too much in my experience are electricity rates that result in unpredictable savings for homeowners. So I want to start by acknowledging if electricity costs less, it's better for heat pump users. And I'm a fan of rates that make it more affordable for heat pump users to use heat pumps. That said, electricity rates are very hard for normal people to understand. They're complicated already. And also on top of that, it's hard to predict exactly how much a person will spend on electricity using their heat pump because that will depend on a lot of very unpredictable things like what is the weather going to be? How is this homeowner going to use their system in real life? What other electric appliances do they have? So because of these things, unless a special electric rate for heat pump users is incredibly simple and the savings are very large, it's unlikely to influence a homeowner's decision about whether or not to buy a heat pump. Okay, section 3 is the ugly. And I thought maybe to try to illustrate my first example, I just share some of the permitting requirements and sort of local requirements for geothermal that we experience every day in our territory. So there are towns that just have policies like Williamstown, Massachusetts, which says we will never allow geothermal drilling. Okay, that's actually not great for us, but it's straightforward. There are other towns like Peekskill, New York, which ironically is our company's one of our headquarters, but the electrician must be a corporate officer in the company. So of course, like this rule and like it expects that electricians will be working for typical HVAC companies, which is understandable, but it's just very hard for a company like Dandelion, where we're trying to scale geothermal and we're this venture-backed company with a board and we do not have an electrician as a corporate officer of the company. So like then there's Irvington, New York that requires us to build a platform, a gravel pit, and a silt fence for drilling, which is just first of all, like not meant for the type of drilling we do, but also makes it too expensive for us to drill. In Sutton and Blandford, Massachusetts, permits are only reviewed in person at a meeting that takes place once a month. In Beverly, Massachusetts, permits are only reviewed in person at a meeting that takes place once a month and only with a specific license holder present. You can read the rest of these. Like some towns have rules about how far away boreholes have to be located from septic or from what anything considered a wetland or the space between bores. And it just basically makes it impossible to put them in a typical yard. And I think like while each of these examples it's its own case, I think the ugly is really that like this every town has the potential to have its own rules like this, and it just makes it very difficult and expensive to try to offer geothermal across a geography because you need to staff to go to the in-person meetings, or like I haven't listed it on this slide, but there are a lot of inspectors that require you to have a trench inspection. So the ground loop in the yard is connected to the heat pump in the home in a horizontal trench. So we have to pay to have our trenching team just be available for a whole day for the inspector to come do the inspection, because they don't give you a time, they give you a day and you have to be there. And ultimately, like, all of this cost is going to be borne by the homeowner, and it's typically not required if they just buy a gas furnace. So this is one of the challenges of scaling geothermal. Okay, another example of the ugly is subsidies for things that are not the legacy way of doing things that that we're trying to move beyond. So for example, in New York, there's something called the 100-foot rule, where if a homeowner is located within 100 feet of the gas line, the utility is to extend gas to that home at no cost to the homeowner. And, you know, it's expensive to do that. If that same amount of money that would go to subsidizing gas line extensions went to subsidizing ground loops, people could just get free ground loops. But that's just not what the policy is. And I do think there are a lot of examples of this where there are still subsidies in place just because of how our infrastructure has been developed that benefit natural gas or other heating fuels, and ultimately compete with the new technologies for heating and cooling, like heat pumps. When I was reflecting on what differentiates the good, the bad, and the ugly, I think that the points I came away with, number one by far, is simplicity is good. There is already a lot of complexity in retrofitting homes and trying to make that cost effective, and having incentives or policies that are simple to understand and communicate and comply with is incredibly helpful. And that simplicity can be like who qualifies for things, what dollar amounts are set, having the same rule apply across as large a geography as possible. All of those things are so helpful. Number two, things that help minimize upfront cost are most helpful. I think most homeowners really care about upfront cost the most. Of course, geothermal, it's great that it's the lowest operating cost system available, and people do value that. But unless the upfront cost is workable for them, they're not going to choose geothermal. Number three, I understand why permits, licenses, inspections, and rebate QA processes need to exist. And I definitely support policy measures that ensure that homeowners are getting a quality system that works. It's good for the industry, and it's definitely good for homeowners too. But I think it's useful to be careful with how this is done, because we have, like, these are all different, we have to deal with all the permitting situation that I showed. We have to deal with the requirements for licenses across plumbing, electrical, sheet metal, drilling, HVAC. So we have to keep track of all of those licenses and the requirements, which differ across authorities having jurisdiction. There are lots of inspection requirements, like the trench inspection I told you about, that also differ. And then each utility has its own rebate QA processes, which involve different photos and different information for different scenarios and different homes. And it's just very difficult to manage all of this soft cost in a way that's cost effective for homeowners. And I will also say, like, often these requirements are not followed by typical HVAC companies. And so the homeowner is making a decision, do I do geothermal or do I just, replace my furnace? And so this just, while I think these things are required, they can act as a disincentive. And then the last theme is it's useful to stop incentivizing the products we'd like people to move away from. One place where this has been really successful is in Colorado. They stopped subsidizing the extension of gas to new communities, and that has actually caused more people to start more builders to start adopting heat pumps. So it's meaningful. So with that, I will end my presentation, but thank you so much for having me and giving me the chance to talk about the good, the bad, and the ugly with geothermal policy.